There is nothing more dangerous than believing that you understand something simply because you are familiar with it. There are books that simply provide information, and there are books that are like a sharpened mirror. Force us to look back at the seemingly most natural movements of the mind. Fast and slow news belongs to the second category. It does not teach us how to think, but rather shows in a meticulous and sometimes ironic way that much of what we think of as thinking is just a series of reflexes and illusions operating in the shadows of consciousness. Reading this book is like opening the door to a room you've lived in all your life but never turned on the light. Prejudices, hasty judgments, and strong beliefs suddenly become fragile when the light of reason shines. And then a question quietly arose. If our own brains constantly deceive us, then who are we really when it comes to making decisions about our lives? And before going into this summary, we encourage listeners to buy and read the book to fully appreciate its content. Because only when you read this book will you understand the issues I am talking about. Buy the books and support the authors because they are lighthouses lighting up the vast sea of knowledge. Now let me start summarizing this book. Part 1. Two systems. In the story of the human mind, there are two main characters who are always present but never appear on stage at the same time. One is quick, with razor-sharp intuition, and the other is slow, calculating, and thoughtful. We cannot understand ourselves without knowing the existence of both. The first one we call System 1, he doesn't sleep, doesn't need orders, and works continuously. He is primitive intuition, the lightning reflex when seeing a shadow of an object rushing towards you, the feeling of knowing someone's face even though you can't remember their name, the ability to complete a sentence like a fish in water before the other person can open their mouth. He doesn't explain, he doesn't analyze, he just reacts and is usually right. Until it is no longer true, the remaining System 2, like a cautious judge who only appears when there is a big deal. He weighed every piece of evidence, weighed every number, and examined every possibility before making a decision, but it was very exhausting. Every time you work, it consumes energy like a giant machine starting up. Therefore, he often leaves the system to handle daily matters, only stepping in when the situation requires it. This is where the fun and danger lies. System 1 is so fast that it seems like an unconscious instinct, but it is not immune to mistakes. System 2 is more accurate but lazy. Often believe the system's reports without verification and coordination or compromise. Between these two people determine all our thoughts, feelings and actions. Imagine you are driving on a familiar road. At first when learning to drive, the two systems strain to control looking at the mirrors, adjusting gears, checking speed. But after hundreds of hours of driving, System 1 has learned every maneuver and can automatically take you home without you remembering the turns you took. Only when there is an unexpected situation, a car suddenly swerves into the lane, System 2 immediately kicks in, taking control. However, this automaticity also makes us susceptible to cognitive traps. System 1 operates by association. And once it has linked A with B, we will believe in that connection unconsciously. Seeing the serious face, maybe that person is difficult. Hear the trembling voice. Maybe that person is lying. Such conclusions come as quickly as lightning, but are not always correct. Not only that, there is a more subtle phenomenon, perceived pleasantness. When a piece of information is repeated or presented clearly and legibly, System 1 immediately labels it trustworthy. A familiar saying is more convincing than a new one even if the content is the same. That is why false rumors, if repeated enough, will gradually become truth in the eyes of the crowd. This comfort also creeps into important decisions. A bold number, a warm color on product packaging, or simply a name that's easy to pronounce. All of which bias us without even realizing the one whisper system. This is familiar so it is safe. And System 2, which doesn't want to waste energy, usually nods in agreement without further investigation. At a deeper level, System 1 functions as a giant associative machine. where every image, sound, and memory is connected into a network. Just one keyword, a whole chain of related memories will pop up. Say doctor, you think of nurse; say bread, you think of butter or jam. Everything happens instantly without having to name it. But it is this same mechanism that makes us vulnerable to subtle cues. A scent, a piece of music, a fleeting image. All can silently change the direction of our thinking. And the strangest thing is, we rarely realize that we are being controlled. The system operates smoothly as the background noise of life. Let System 2 believe that every decision is their own initiative, but the truth is different. Most of what we believe and do has been prescripted by a system. The second system only plays the role of censorship in a careless manner. If System 1 is the tireless storyteller, System 2 is the indulgent editor. A well-crafted story that is emotionally plausible will usually pass through the System 2 censorship without question. We believe a chain of events simply because it is coherent, not because it is true. This explains why we are more easily persuaded by compelling stories than by dry facts. The laziness of System 2 is also manifested in its avoidance of anything that requires effort. Even when a major issue arises. If the solution available from System 1 sounds reasonable, System 2 will quickly accept it instead of analyzing it on its own. This is the brain's energy-saving mechanism, but it is also the source of countless errors in thinking. A classic experiment illustrates this. You are asked a bat and a ball that cost a total of $1. 10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? Most people, even smart people, reply immediately. 10 cents. That's the answer given by System 1, quick and smooth. But when System 2 actually works, the correct number is 5 cents, and this small difference shows that we are usually satisfied with the first answer. Just because it comes easily, System 1 is also heavily influenced by context. When you just saw a string of numbers 8, 7, 6, you will estimate the number of countries in Africa higher than when you just saw a string of 1, 2. Even though the question is exactly the same, this effect is called anchoring, and it shows that our perception is never completely objective. It is always skewed by the information that has just come before it. The associative mechanism of System 1 can be useful in helping us recognize patterns and predict situations. But it's also a double-edged sword. When an idea is associated with strong emotions, it will trigger a series of associations with the same tone. Bad economic news can make you pessimistic about the political future. Even though these two areas are not directly related, that is how the mind creates the halo effect. A first impression lingers and colors every subsequent judgment. And then there's something called perceived pleasantness. When information is presented clearly, is easy to read, and is easy to remember, it becomes more credible in our eyes. This explains why companies invest in simple, concise logos or eye-catching packaging. Not only are they easily recognizable, but consumers also subconsciously associate them with quality and reliability. Conversely, when information is difficult to read or understand, System 2 is forced to kick in and we become more cautious and less gullible. But the paradox is that comfort does not equal truth. A lie repeated often enough becomes familiar. And then there are the credible, the propagandists, the advertisers. Even information manipulators exploit this to their advantage. The familiar gradually replaces the true in our minds. And then the truth becomes the underdog in everyday life. System 1 helps us survive by reacting quickly, but it also gives us the illusion of understanding. When we witness an event, System 1 immediately creates a plausible story that makes us believe we understand why it happened. System 2, unless particularly vigilant, will nod in agreement. And so, we are not only fooled by the world, but also fool ourselves on a deeper level. These two systems do not operate independently but constantly interact. System 1 makes instant predictions based on past data and current emotions. System 2 can correct errors, but doing so requires will and energy. When we are tired, distracted, or stressed, System 2 easily lets go of control, allowing System 1 to take complete charge. And that's when we're more likely to make decisions we later regret. There is one more aspect about the two systems that is little noticed. They differ not only in speed and accuracy but also in how they consume energy. System 2, when operated for a long time, will drain mental resources, making us susceptible to mental exhaustion. This phenomenon is called decision fatigue. After a long day of considering, choosing, and calculating, we become more lenient, less self-controlled, and willing to choose the easy option even though we know it is not optimal. A typical example comes from studies of judges. When reviewing parole applications, the likelihood of an inmate's approval is significantly higher in the morning when judges are alert and drops sharply before lunch or at the end of the day. When energy is depleted, when tired. System 2 almost falls asleep, leaving System 1 to play it safe, refusing to take risks. Therefore, any task that requires careful analysis becomes less effective when we are tired. You can see this in life. After focusing on a complex task, it's easy to succumb to sugary treats, make impulse purchases, or procrastinate on other important tasks. Ironically, System 1 is more active during those times when System 2 is weakened. Instinctive reflexes, fleeting emotions, and deep-seated prejudices easily take over. That is why advertising campaigns often target times when audiences are relaxed. Be careful when simple messages repeated over and over again can go straight into the system for a check. System 1 is also a master at creating the illusion of truth. A sentence, heard over and over again, becomes familiar and therefore trustworthy. This is tied to biological mechanisms. The brain prioritizes information that is easy to process because it requires less effort. But that means we can believe something completely false just because it sounds good and is easy to remember. There is also another phenomenon called substitution effect. When faced with a difficult question, System 1 often surreptitiously substitutes an easier question that it knows the answer to. For example, if asked how happy you are with your life, System 1 might silently translate into how is your mood today, and respond based on current emotions. System 2, if not vigilant, will accept that answer as if it reflects the original question. This way of operating causes us to misjudge many important issues. When deciding to buy a house, instead of carefully analyzing the investment value, many people only rely on the impression of light, space, or window view. When voting, some voters are influenced by a candidate's appearance or voice rather than policies. System 1 prefers simple, intuitive signals. The two-stroke system should have done more in-depth analysis but often let things slide. The issue is not that one system is better than the other. Both are necessary. System 1 helps us react promptly, processing huge amounts of information in the blink of an eye. System 2 provides precision, control, and planning, but it is the imbalance between them that matters. When System 1 is too active and System 2 is too lazy, it is the cause of a series of errors in perception and decision-making. Understanding this relationship is the first step to becoming less controlled by unconscious reflexes. We don't always need System 2. Life would be paralyzed if everything had to be over-analyzed. But we can't let the system act on its own. The trick lies in knowing when to trust your intuition and when to stop. Turn on System 2 and ask a question. One way to better visualize the difference between the two systems is to observe how they react to unexpected situations. When you are walking and see an object suddenly fall from above, you immediately dodge to the side. It is a one-stop, fast, automatic system that requires no analysis. After a few seconds passed, System 2 spoke. It looks like it's just a leaf, not a brick. If you relied only on System 2, you would probably get injured because you reacted too slowly. But if you rely on just one system, you'll waste time avoiding countless false threats every day. However, this speed comes at a price. System 1 is not good with numbers and probabilities. It's more about story than facts. Upon hearing that a plane crash had just occurred, System 1 immediately assigned the flight a dangerous label even though the probability of an accident was still extremely low. System 2, if worked hard at, will remind you that millions of flights are safe every day, but the feeling of insecurity has formed and is hard to erase. This is why we often exaggerate rare risks and downplay familiar ones. Traffic accidents, heart disease, or poor eating habits are the leading causes of death, but they scare us less than a terrorist attack. Something that happens rarely but creates a strong image in memory. System A responds strongly to what is concrete, vivid, and emotionally charged. While System 2 has to make a great effort to resist that attraction. Another characteristic of System 1 is the need to seek consistency. It hates inconsistencies and will go to any lengths to remove or fill in gaps in the story. If one piece of information is missing, System 1 will rely on the remaining part to make sense. This creates the illusion of understanding. We believe we understand the cause of an event, when in reality we are just piecing together pieces into a coherent story. Researchers also found that once System 1 had formed a first impression, System 2 tended to be more of a defense attorney than a fair judge. Instead of looking for truth, it looks for evidence to reinforce existing beliefs. Once you trust someone, they are trustworthy, you will interpret all their actions in a positive light. And conversely, this fact is a warning. Not only are humans prone to making mistakes, but they also defend those mistakes with their rationality. System 1 lays the foundation, System 2 builds the walls, and we are stuck in our own fortress of belief. However, there are situations where System 1 is a reliable ally. For those with deep expertise, their intuition is trained through thousands of hours of experience, making instant reactions accurate. A chess player can recognize his opponent's tactics at a glance. An experienced doctor can diagnose the disease just by observing the patient's gait or facial expression here. System 1 is based on a huge store of accumulated and organized data rather than on superficial associations. This leads to an important principle of intuitive reliability when it comes from a stable environment with clear rules and the decision maker has a lot of practical experience in that environment. Conversely, in complex, volatile fields or when we lack experience, System 1 can easily lead us to mistakes and requires close supervision from System 2. But for the dual monitoring system to be effective, it needs to be awakened. This requires us to recognize warning signs when the answer comes too quickly and too easily, when the emotion is too strong, or when the context is so familiar that it doesn't require thinking. That's when it's time to stop asking questions and give System 2 time to work. What we have just seen shows that these two systems are not only different in speed and function, but also two parallel ways of existing in the human mind. One side is survival instinct, the other side is analytical reason. The problem is that we tend to overestimate the role of reason and underestimate the power of instinct most of the time. System 1 acts as the autopilot of our lives. It handles familiar situations, recognizes faces, understands language, and predicts what's going to happen next. System 2 only kicks in when something is unusual or when we are deliberately concentrating. But the trap is that we often think we are in control with our minds when in fact System 1 has already taken the wheel, and System 2 is just validating that decision. This makes it easy to fall into the illusion of autonomy. We believe we are the decision makers. But in fact, a series of unconscious reflexes and biases guide small factors such as the order in which information is presented, the way questions are asked, or the mood at the time of receiving the information can all change the outcome without us even realizing it. One way to recognize the influence of System 1 is to look at situations where we make quick decisions. No need to think. Sometimes it's a sign of experience. But sometimes it's just an emotional reaction. The wisdom lies in knowing when to trust that reaction and when to hold back and check. Conversely, System 2 is not always a savior. It can be biased by the very beliefs created by System 1. It also consumes a lot of energy, making it easy to skip necessary analysis when tired or pressed for time. The power of System 20 lies not in completely replacing System 1 but in its ability to regulate, balance and monitor it. Understanding these two systems opens up a new perspective on human beings. It explains why we are smart in some situations but make stupid mistakes in others. It shows that emotion and reason are not two complete opposites but two companions who sometimes complement and sometimes hinder each other. If we want to improve our decision-making, we can't just think more or trust our feelings more. Instead, we need to know when to let System 1 take the lead, such as when reacting to immediate danger or in areas of expertise. And when to force System 2 to stay awake, such as when faced with complex problems, financial decisions, or when new information contradicts old beliefs. Recognizing the limitations of both systems also helps us to be more humble. We understand that we are not always right. And many decisions are certainly just the product of unconscious reflexes. This humility, if maintained, becomes a guard against major mistakes. And thus, the story of P1 comes to an end. In each of our heads there exist two companions, one is quick but sometimes hasty. A slow but lazy person. Together they write every action, every choice, every belief. Understand them. We will understand ourselves better and have the opportunity to change the way we live, think and decide. Part 2, Shortcuts and biases are an illusion that humans often fall into. We think of ourselves as rational creatures, analyzing information before making decisions. But the truth is much more brutal. Most of the time, we rely on mental shortcuts. The heuristics the brain uses to save time and effort. They are the magic tricks that help us survive in a changing environment, but they also cause us to repeatedly make the same mistakes in the same pattern. Imagine you have to answer a difficult question. What is the divorce rate in country X? If you don't have the data at hand, System 1 will do a very clever job. It will replace this question with an easier one. Like, do I know anyone in that country who got divorced? Or do I remember any news about this? The answer comes so quickly and smoothly that you will believe it is reasonable. But that's just a question substitution, not a real solution. One of the most powerful heuristics is the na effect when having to estimate a number. Our brains are strongly influenced by the first number we see even if it is completely random. If, before asking how many countries in Africa are members of the United Nations, one spins a number wheel that stops at 65, your estimate will be significantly higher than if the wheel stopped at 10. Anchors are like stones tied to the mind. You can pull it away but rarely get rid of its original weight. Remember those price negotiations? If the seller quotes too high an initial figure, every subsequent price will be inflated against the real value. That's why real estate agents often show clients one house that's too expensive so the next one looks more reasonable. System 1 doesn't analyze it thoroughly, it just feels like this price looks good compared to the anchor point that was just set. Then there is the representativeness, the habit of judging based on superficial similarity rather than true probability. If you meet a well-dressed, articulate person, you are more likely to believe they are a lawyer than a security guard. Even when the probability of the security guard profession is many times higher, System 1 prefers plausible stories with pre-existing patterns and it often ignores probabilistic logic. This is why people often fall into the trap of judging based on appearance or believing in stereotypes. Also cannot ignore the inherent heuristic. The tendency to judge probability based on how memorable an event is. If you have recently heard about shark attacks, you may judge swimming in the ocean to be more dangerous than it actually is. The brain believes that memorable means frequent, but that's an illusion. In fact, what we remember most is often the rare but dramatic ones. And because of that, they distort our perception of the world. These hurrits were great survival tools in primitive environments where we needed to react quickly with little information. But in today's complex world, they can easily lead us to make wrong decisions. The danger is that we don't even realize we're using them. The answer came so quickly and smoothly that we believed we had just thought it through. In fact, System 1 has already automatically pressed the select button. If the nail effect, representative heuristic, and available HISIC are the three prominent shortcuts, there is another silent machine that System 1 operates. The need to find causes. Humans hate randomness, and the brain will invent explanations even when the data is too little or irrelevant. Imagine you hear that a company's stock price has risen sharply during the day. System 1 will look for a reason, maybe a new product, good news from the market, or a new CEO. For no apparent reason, it will construct a story from fragments of information. And when that story is emotionally plausible, System 2 will easily accept it as true. This leads to the illusion of cause. Believe that we know why things happen. In reality, many phenomena are simply random. A variation of this illusion is the illusion of understanding following the HS Bears incident. When an event has happened, we look back and see it as obvious. The market crashed, I knew the bubble was going to burst and a couple got divorced. I realized from the beginning that they were not compatible. In fact, before the incident happened, no one was sure of anything. But System 1, with its need to turn everything into a seamless story, will have us believe we've always known it. Likewise, the framing effect is a clear demonstration that human decisions depend on how information is presented, not just the content. A surgery with a 90% survival rate sounds a lot better than one with a 10% mortality rate. Even though the two sentences are statistically equivalent. System 1 responds to the emotional context the words create, and System 2, if not alert, is pulled along without realizing it. The power of framing effects is also exploited extensively in politics, media, and advertising. A new tax policy can be described as either supporting low-income earners or punishing the rich, depending on the persuasive intent. Each presentation evokes different emotions and thereby directs public opinion in the desired direction. Go deeper, it can be pointed out that these heuristics are not just individual flaws but systemic. That means if you put 100 people in the same situation, most will make the same type of mistake. Because we all share these thinking mechanisms. That's why these mistakes are called cognitive biases rather than random errors. The annoying thing is that even when we know about it, it's still hard to avoid. Understanding the anchoring effect does not make us completely immune to it. Knowing that heurism inherently distorts perception doesn't stop us from overestimating salient events. We can minimize the impact by proactively activating System 2. Ask questions that require data, test assumptions. But this requires constant effort, and this is the paradox. The human brain is optimized to save effort, so it will always favor shortcuts. We cannot erase ICS. The only thing we can do is learn to recognize when they are leading us so we can decide whether to believe them or not. One clear demonstration of the power of heuristics is how they confuse possibility and probability. When faced with a complex situation, System 1 often replaces the original difficult question with an easier one and relies on immediate emotions to answer. This leads to a series of biases that even intelligent and experienced people find difficult to escape. For example, the law of small numbers effect makes us believe that a small sample still accurately represents the whole. If 3 of your friends drink a herbal tea and feel better, it's easy to believe that the tea works. Forget that personal experience is too little data to draw any real conclusions. Small samples have a very large range of variation and can easily create a false impression. But a system that loves simple stories will ignore the random element and believe that rare evidence. Another bias is the illusion of the rationality of Corin Bear's world. When a story is told smoothly and logically, we tend to believe it regardless of the actual facts. For example, if you hear that Linda majored in philosophy, is deeply concerned about social justice, and has protested against nuclear power, you are more likely to think of Linda as a banker and environmental activist than Linda as a banker. Although in terms of probability, the second option is always higher. This is the conjunction fallacy trap, where System 1 is driven by story rather than numbers. Then comes the illusion of predictability. When we observe a person or a system operating consistently for a period of time, we believe we can accurately predict their future behavior. Forgetting that randomness and external fluctuations always exist. Investors, for example, often believe that a fund that is performing well will continue to do so. Although long-term data shows that past performance is a poor predictor of the future. System 1 is also susceptible to the small world effect. Believing that everything that happens has a specific cause and that if we knew enough information, we could explain it all. But in reality many complex phenomena operate according to the laws of probability and it is impossible to predict each individual case accurately. It is worth noting that these deviations are not brain errors in the usual sense. They are the byproduct of a system optimized for speed and efficiency in the evolutionary environment of the primitive jungle. Making quick decisions based on a few signals can save lives. But in modern society, where information is huge and systems are complex, these code errors can easily lead us to wrong decisions. Especially in the fields of finance, medicine, and public policy. The most dangerous thing is not the existence of heuristics but the illusion that we are immune to them. The feeling that I know I'm thinking rationally is a sign that System 1 has won and System 2 is asleep. I realize that the greatest human weakness is not the lack of information but the way we process that information. We believe we observe the world objectively, but in reality every fact passes through the prism of our mental shortcuts. And when these shortcuts work smoothly, we rarely feel the need to check again. One of the inherent biases is confirmation bias. Once we have an initial belief, we seek information that reinforces it and ignore contradictory facts. If we believe the real estate market is going to rise, we will pay attention to every positive news story and ignore warning signs. Not only is this an unconscious bias, it's also the brain's way of saving energy. It's much more comfortable to stick with a familiar story than to accept being wrong. There are also times when a system is so confident that it not only ignores contradictory data but also invents connections between disparate events. We see two events happening close together and immediately conclude that one caused the other. Meanwhile, the actual probability may just be a coincidence. Yet a clear causal story is always more appealing than admitting that sometimes the world is simply chaotic. When we apply heuristics to decisions involving risk, we often get it completely wrong. Studies show that people tend to overestimate the probability of rare but dramatic events and underestimate the probability of common but insidious events. Fear terrorism more than heart disease, fear sharks more than traffic accidents. That is clear evidence. The brain favors strong images, not probabilities. Another subtle factor is the ease of memory when an image, sound, or story sticks in memory. It will be systemically labeled important. So, dramatic news footage, moving stories, or a powerful personal experience can shape our perception of an entire issue. Even when the overall data says otherwise, I've seen this happen over and over again in finance, healthcare, and politics. A rare but shocking incident can change national policy simply because the public cannot get it out of their minds. Dry statistics about thousands of other cases do not carry the same emotional weight, and when emotion prevails, reason backs down. The most dangerous thing is that we believe we are thinking rationally while in fact we are just following a familiar script that our brain has written. Humility not only influences the answers we give, but also determines the questions we ask ourselves. And when the question is wrong, all the reasoning behind it is meaningless. What I've learned from decades of observation is that people rarely make decisions based solely on the pure facts of every option. Even seemingly logical things are shaped by how information appears and how it touches emotions. A number does not exist independently. It is set in a story, a setting, and that determines how we feel when we have to choose between two options. Describing their benefits or harms will lead to completely different results for the same drug. But a 90% survival rate would be more acceptable to many people than a 10% mortality rate. It's not a change in facts, it's a change in the lens of perception, and the brain, especially System 1, is always influenced by that lens. There are cases where heuristics help us react quickly and in the right direction. When we are driving and see the brake lights ahead come on, we immediately slow down without thinking. But in complex problems like investing, forecasting, or policymaking, these shortcuts turn into traps. They give us a sense of certainty when in reality, I'm just having an illusion. I have seen investors who were absolutely confident in their gut after a few winning trades, only to lose everything when the market turned. They forget that previous success may have been just the result of luck, but System 1 turns it into evidence of superior ability. And when this belief is strong enough, System 2 will also stop arguing, becoming an unconditional acceptor. Cognitive biases do not discriminate between smart and unintelligent people, experienced and beginners. They are a common product of how the brain evolved. Therefore, to minimize mistakes, we cannot rely solely on personal confidence. We have to build a process that forces System 2 to participate. This process involves actively searching for evidence that contradicts initial beliefs, comparing multiple frames of information, and identifying emotional factors that are driving the decision. But even with a process, we cannot completely eliminate the influence of heuristics. They are like an undercurrent in the mind, sometimes helping us sail smoothly, sometimes pulling us in the wrong direction. Understanding them is not about getting rid of them, but about learning to steer the ship. Know when to let go and when to hold on tight. What we think of as logical thinking is actually just a thin layer covering a series of automatic, emotional mechanisms. And biased. Only when we realize this, do we have the opportunity to make more informed decisions. Knowing that even then, the brain's shortcuts are always waiting to lead us down the familiar path. Third, overconfidence. Confidence is what helps people dare to step out of their comfort zone and dare to try things they have never done before. But when it goes beyond the limit, it turns into an elaborate trap. A trap that the victim does not realize until he has slipped. I call it overconfidence, and it's not just a bad habit but a bias that's ingrained in the way your brain works. The root of overconfidence lies in the illusion that we understand more than we actually do. When looking back at past events, the brain constructs a coherent story full of causes. The results are clear. We remember the steps that led to the result but forget that we were confused and uncertain. And then when the story is complete, it feels like we've always known it. Although the truth is quite the opposite. An obvious example is the financial world. After a strong market rally, investors look back and believe that the rally was predictable. They tie it to factors like policy, currency, market sentiment, or consumer trends. But before everything happens, no one dares to say for sure. They forget that the picture is then hazy and full of different possibilities. This is the illusion of predictability. Along with this illusion comes a tendency to disregard randomness. We like to think that success is a result of skill. Failure is due to mistakes or external circumstances. But in reality, luck and risk play a bigger role than we like to admit. A fund manager can win big 3 years in a row, but that's mostly due to favorable markets. When the storm hits, true skill is revealed and often not as glorious as the previous story. More dangerous. Once a success story is accepted, it becomes a template for predicting the future. We look at factors that have appeared before and expect them to produce similar results. The brain loves consistency, so it ignores the possibility that the context has changed and new elements will lead to completely different results. Overconfidence also causes us to misjudge our abilities in areas in which we have little experience. This phenomenon is so common that it has its own name. Kruger-Runing effect. Ignorant people often overestimate their abilities. While truly talented people often doubt themselves, this creates a paradox. It is the least capable people who are most confident in their decisions. Overconfidence is not limited to the inexperienced, even seasoned professionals suffer from it, sometimes even more severely. Years of experience give them a huge database. And that's what makes them believe they see patterns in complex situations. But the real world rarely operates according to fixed rules. It is variable, interactive, and contains many unpredictable elements in areas such as economics or politics. People in high positions are often forced to make forecasts. This prediction was viewed by the public and the media as a form of truth. When a forecast is correct, it strengthens the reputation of the person who made it. When wrong, collective memory often ignores or is quickly forgotten. This creates a dangerous loop. People who frequently make confident forecasts are seen as more trustworthy even if their accuracy rate is no higher than others. A classic experiment illustrates this when people are asked to make a prediction about an event and include their level of confidence. Most people overestimate accuracy. For example, they claim I am 90% sure, but the actual correct rate is only about 70%. This gap between belief and reality is a measure of overconfidence, and it appears in almost every group of people from students to military professionals. One factor contributing to this phenomenon is the way the brain processes memories. When a prediction goes wrong, we often attribute it to an unusual event or incomplete information. Rather than admit that their mental models are flawed, their predictive memories are often revised as well. We remember saying something different than the truth, or we remember suspecting it from the beginning even though we had no evidence. The consequences of overconfidence are particularly evident in strategic decisions. A CEO may believe that an acquisition will yield large returns based on experience from previous successes. But they may forget that previous times took place in completely different contexts or thanks to unrepeatable lucky factors. When decisions are based on familiar stories rather than objective data, risks increase significantly. The scary thing is that overconfidence often comes across as convincing to others. People who speak with a decisive voice without hesitation are more likely to be seen as trustworthy. Regardless of whether the content is accurate or not, this is why bad decisions are sometimes strongly supported. It's not because people believe in data, but because they believe in the conviction of the leader. One of the most subtle manifestations of overconfidence is the illusion of the accuracy of existing information. When we have a specific set of data, our brain assumes it is enough to draw a conclusion. Even if that piece of data is just a small piece of the whole picture. We do not realize that what we know is surrounded by a vast blind area, an area that, if illuminated, could completely change our perception. I have seen this happen when groups of experts analyze the market. They can have very detailed numbers about an industry and build predictive models from that. These models appear scientific and robust, but often ignore unexpected variables, policy changes, natural disasters, or fluctuations in consumer sentiment. When the unexpected happens, the whole model collapses, but they quickly create a new story to explain it. As if the recent results were still within expectations. Overconfidence also causes us to underestimate how volatile the world is. We forget that many systems from stock markets to weather are inherently chaotic and unpredictable. Instead of accepting uncertainty, the brain tries to force the world into an understandable structure, reducing feelings of anxiety. But the price to pay for this peace of mind is decisions based on the wrong model. Part of the reason is that humans are not good at probabilistic thinking. Instead of saying there is a 30% chance of it happening, we often translate it to either it will happen or it won't happen. System 1 likes black and white answers, and decisiveness makes us feel in control of the situation. But in reality, the world operates in gray areas, and ignoring probabilities leaves us vulnerable to surprises in outcomes. I realized a paradox. It is the initial successes that feed overconfidence. When a risky decision is successful, we not only take credit for the outcome but also attribute credit to our own skill, ignoring the element of luck. And the more times we do that, the more willing we are to make risky decisions. Believe that you have special abilities to control outcomes. When luck leaves, the fall will be more painful in military, business or politics. The biggest mistakes often come from the biggest winners. Victory brings confidence, confidence lowers vigilance, and lack of vigilance opens the door to defeat. But this loop is rarely seen from the inside, only when looking back from a distance do we see how clear it is. One of the most dangerous consequences of overconfidence is the illusion of control. As we get used to seeing the connection between our actions and the results we achieve, our brains begin to believe that we can control factors that are otherwise out of our reach. The truth is that not all good results are the result of skill, and not all bad results are due to individual mistakes. But when we believe in absolute control, we act as if we are immune to risks in the corporate environment. This is evident in decisions to expand or make large investments. A company may be wildly successful in its home market, and its management may believe that the same formula will work in another country. They ignore cultural, political, legal differences, variables that cannot be guided by past experience. And when the project fails, the familiar explanation rings out again. We are not lucky this time. Overconfidence is also contagious. When a leader appears confident and unwavering, those around him or her are drawn into a false sense of security. This is especially dangerous in decision-making groups because it reduces the tendency to criticize. Voices of warning are seen as lacking faith or pessimism. And eventually the whole group slid into the inertia of false beliefs. Another factor that contributes to maintaining overconfidence is the gap between actions and consequences. When consequences are not immediate or unclear, the brain tends to underestimate the risk. A rash decision can take months, even years, to show its consequences. During that time, each temporary positive result further reinforces the illusion that we are on the right track. I have met stock traders who believe their strategy cannot be wrong just because they have several profitable months in a row. They forget that the market may be in a generally favorable phase and anyone would profit if they did the same. When the cycle changes, their portfolios evaporate faster than they can react. And then the story of confidence became a bitter lesson. Sadly, even after failure, many people still do not give up their overconfidence. The brain will restructure memories, turning failures into exceptions and continuing to maintain beliefs about self-control. Therefore, overconfidence is not just a mistake, it is a self-protective system, constantly reinforcing and feeding itself. When I look closely, I realize that overconfidence does not exist in isolation. It is a product of a combination of mechanisms: selective memory, illusions of control, random underestimation, and comfort with coherent stories. They intertwine, forming an invisible net around our thoughts, making it difficult to escape. The problem is not only that we overestimate ourselves, but also that our environment rewards confidence. A person who speaks assertively is more likely to be promoted than a hesitant person. A market analyst who makes a strong forecast will attract more attention than a cautious one. In a world where attention is a precious resource, assertiveness is sometimes more important than accuracy. As a result, people who succeed because of their overconfidence continue to spread that confidence to others. The success stories are told without details about luck or uncontrollable variables. The listener sees only one clear path from point A to point B and believes they can repeat it. Regardless of the different context, things become dangerous when decisions are made about war and billions of dollars in investments. National policy is again made in this state of mind. When risk is underestimated and predictability is overestimated, the whole system is left vulnerable. And when an incident occurs, the consequences do not stop at one individual or one organization but spread to the whole society. The paradox is that overconfidence is almost impossible to completely eliminate. It is closely tied to the nature of the brain. An evolutionary tool for making quick decisions in uncertain environments, but if we can't eliminate it, we can still control it. The only way is to create a counterargument mechanism, actively seek out opposing views, demand evidence for every prediction, and remind myself that I could be wrong. Intellectual humility is not weakness. It is a wall of defense against major mistakes. Every time we realize we have overestimated our abilities, we not only avoid a fall but also learn a lesson about the limits of human perception. And it is there, in the moment of admitting uncertainty, that clear thinking begins to take shape. Part 4, Choices. Long ago, we are taught that humans make decisions based on reason. In classical economics, each individual is considered a rational optimizer. Compare the benefits and costs and choose the option with the greatest value. But in reality, when I observe choices in life, I realize one thing: we don't measure the absolute value of the results. Instead, we compare them to a reference point, a mental benchmark that we consider normal or expected. If someone is earning $20 million a month and gets an extra $5 million, they feel satisfied. But another person who used to earn $30 million and then dropped to $25 million will feel the loss. Even though both ended at $25 million. Their emotions don't come from the absolute number, but from where the result falls relative to the original reference point. It is from this observation that I build the prospectory theory. It starts with a simple but powerful truth. People hate losses more than they love gains. Losing $100 causes much more pain than the pleasure of gaining $100. This phenomenon is called loss aversion, and it affects almost every decision we make, from spending to investing. From contract negotiations to national policy. Loss aversion leads to seemingly irrational investing behavior. One is willing to hold a losing stock for a very long time just to avoid realizing the loss. Because selling means admitting loss, but at the same time they are willing to sell a profitable stock to lock in profit. Even though in the long run, holding it may be more profitable, the fear of loss makes us take risks when we are losing and avoid risks when we are winning, which is the exact opposite of the optimal strategy. The reference point is not always clear. It can be formed from the initial purchase price, current salary, social expectations, or simply the most recent results we have experienced. And as the reference point changes, so does the way we perceive risk. A runner who finishes second by a narrow margin is often more disappointed than a third-place finisher because their reference point is victory. The third-place finisher compared it to almost not getting a medal. But the asymmetry in emotions doesn't stop at joy and pain, it's amplified by the information framing effect. When an outcome is described as a 90% chance of survival, people react very differently than when it is described as a 10% chance of death. Even though both are the same reality, the way information is framed changes System 1's perspective, and System 2 rarely intervenes in time to neutralize that influence. Interestingly, prospect theory explains many phenomena that classical economics cannot explain. Why do people buy insurance for small risks to avoid mental loss? Why do negotiations often stall when one side feels it has more to lose than to gain? And why can financial markets fall into a state of mass panic just because of a sudden drop in prices? When I looked more closely, I realized that loss aversion not only affects financial decisions but permeates almost every area of life. An employee negotiating a raise might react strongly to a 5% pay cut, but not be equally excited about a 5% raise. An athlete takes more risks than usual when he is losing just to avoid the feeling of failure. This asymmetry creates the shape of the prospect theory value curve. The loss side is much steeper than the profit side. In other words, the pain of loss is often double or even triple the joy of gain. This explains why we tend to be conservative when things are going well but reckless when trying to recoup losses. A clear example is investor behavior in the stock market. When a stock is losing money, many people choose to hold on to it in the hope that it will recover because selling means locking in the loss. Conversely, when a stock increases in price, they sell early to preserve profits even though the probability of further increase is still high. This is a paradox. Loss aversion causes them to unintentionally cut short gains and prolong losses. The reference point that determines whether we feel we are gaining or losing is very flexible and easily manipulated. It can be established by recent personal experience, initial purchase price, or information from others. A person who buys a cheap airline ticket will be satisfied until he finds out that his friend bought the same flight at a lower price. Instantly, the reference point shifted and the feeling of satisfaction turned to regret. Even though they actually lose nothing more. Marketers understand this and use it as a tool. When a product is labeled as discounted from $500,000 to $350,000, your reference point would be $500,000 and $350,000 becomes a bargain. Even if the price is really reasonable at only around $300,000. The feeling of avoiding a loss is much stronger than the feeling of gaining a gain. Another interesting aspect is how humans handle small probabilities. Prospect theory suggests that we often overestimate the value of very small probabilities, leading us to be willing to pay a lot of money to completely eliminate the risk or to buy a lottery ticket even though the probability of winning is almost zero. The feeling of having a slim chance is more stimulating than improving an already high probability. This explains why lottery insurance and many forms of betting exist side by side. The same person can rationally buy insurance to eliminate the risk of a 1% loss and also buy lottery tickets to pursue the 1% chance of winning big. These two decisions are contradictory, but emotionally both make sense. One to avoid loss, one to dream of victory. Dig deeper into how we handle risk. I realized a paradox. The same person can be both risk-averse and risk-seeking. Depending on whether they are in a profit or loss zone relative to their winning reference point. We often avoid risks to preserve results when we are losing. We are willing to bet big for a chance to win back. This phenomenon explains behavior in casinos. A player who wins will bet more cautiously. But when they lose deeply, they often increase the bet. Not because you believe you will win, but because losing more is not much worse than losing now, while the chance of getting it all back still exists. The brain in a loss state becomes more reckless because of loss aversion. They seek a big win to erase their emotional pain. Another important consequence of prospect theory is the nonlinearity of emotions. The difference between getting nothing and getting 100 units of value creates a much stronger emotion than the difference between getting 1,000 and getting 1,100 even though both are 100 units. In other words, the emotional impact decreases as the absolute value increases. This is why removing a small fee entirely can be just as satisfying as reducing a larger fee by just a small percentage. When applied to public policy, this opens up different approaches. For example, in energy conservation incentive programs, waste avoidance messages are often more effective than additional savings because they appeal to the fear of loss rather than the potential gain. Similarly, a public health campaign might focus on the risk of health loss rather than the promise of health improvement to promote preventive behavior. The information framing effect continues to play a key role when choosing between two healthcare options. One plan is certain to save 200 lives and another plan has a 1/3 chance of saving all 600 lives but a 2/3 chance of saving no one. Most people will choose the safe option first. But when the same problem is expressed as 400 people are certain to die versus a 1/3 chance that no one will die. With a 2/3 chance of 600 deaths, the majority favor the risky option. The only change here is the framing. One focus on survival, one focus on death. I realized that our choices, whether related to money, health, or time, are strongly dependent on our psychological context. We are not absolute value calculating machines but emotional creatures constantly measuring gains and losses against an invisible benchmark, and that benchmark itself. It is the reference point that shapes behavior rather than the outcome itself. One thing I noticed is that the reference point never stays still. It shifts over time, with new experiences, and with the social comparisons we constantly make. Once we achieve an achievement, it quickly becomes the new normal, and all subsequent results are compared to this new normal rather than the original starting point. Therefore, satisfaction is often short-lived. A big winner may be happy for a few months, but then their standard of living and expectations increase, and what was once a huge benefit becomes the default. The reason is not because humans are ungrateful, but because the brain is programmed to adjust the norm to continue searching for new rewards. This also explains why sudden losses have a much more profound effect than equivalent gains when losses occur. The reference point is pulled down suddenly, and this feeling hits the emotional system hard. Unlike adaptation to capital gains that takes place from losses, create an immediate shock that leaves a lasting mark on the memory in the business environment. Managing customer expectations is a clear illustration. A company can keep its service prices stable for years, but even a small increase can create a wave of protest. Because customers perceive it as a loss compared to the old reference point. Conversely, discounts or added incentives often fail to create lasting excitement because customers quickly adjust their expectations and consider it the new norm. Another consequence of loss aversion is the tendency to lock into current choices. Even if there is a better option, people often value what they own more than what they don't own. A phenomenon called the Enderman effect. Once something belongs to us, its perceived value increases, and giving it up becomes much more difficult than receiving it in the first place. This effect doesn't just apply to material things. A job position, a relationship, or even a long-standing habit can become a psychological asset that we try to hold on to. Even giving it up will bring greater benefits. The reason is that the brain does not compare the new benefits with the current ones objectively, but focuses on what will be lost if it changes. Therefore, every change must overcome the psychological barrier of loss. Successful leaders often understand this and seek to frame change as a complement rather than a replacement to reduce natural resistance. In observing thousands of human decisions in different situations, I realized that our choices are not only governed by benefits and costs, but also by the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. We want to believe that we are consistent, rational, and in control of our circumstances. But in reality, those stories are often built on a foundation of emotions and fluctuating reference points. Prospect theory suggests that we respond to change rather than reacting directly to absolute states. A person who loses 10 million from an investment will be in more pain than another person who did not invest and did not earn that money. The difference is not in the end result but in the psychological journey from point A to point B. This opens up an important insight. If we want to change people's behavior, we need to change their reference point or how they feel about the reference point. A new benefit introduced as an additional bonus is much more likely to be accepted than one that replaces an old benefit of equal total value. However, recognizing the impact of loss aversion and the information framing effect does not mean we can easily overcome them. Even knowing you're being affected, emotions still play a strong role in decisions. This is part of the reason why marketing, political, and media campaigns are often more successful at exploiting fear of loss than promising gain. Another application is in the field of negotiation. When a proposal is presented as avoiding harm rather than gaining benefit, it is often more persuasive. Good negotiators know how to shape their demands to trigger the other party's natural defensive response. Make them willing to compromise to avoid loss. Humans are not objective utility-maximizing machines but rather emotional value-maximizing creatures relative to the reference point they are clinging to. Understanding this not only helps us better predict other people's behavior, but also gives us a clearer view of how we make our own decisions and sometimes the courage to adjust them before it's too late. Part 5. Too dark. I have long been haunted by a seemingly simple question. When I say I am happy, which self is speaking? This question leads me to an important discovery. Within every human being there exist two distinct selves and they do not always agree. The experiencing self lives in the continuous flow of time. It feels every moment the taste of a cup of morning coffee, the ache in its knee, the laughter of a friend with it. Happiness or misery is measured by the quality of each moment that is happening. If this series of moments is pleasant, the self experiences life as good. What I remember is different. It does not live in the moment but in memories and stories. It doesn't care how many hours you've spent, pleasant or unpleasant. It only retains the most prominent and concluding pieces of the experience. It is this ego that determines what story you will tell about your last vacation, a relationship that ended, or a painful surgery. And this is where the contradiction arises. The experiencing self wants to maximize present pleasure, while the remembering self wants to maximize a memorable story. Even though the story may contain painful moments. I once asked a group of people, if your first vacation was great but all your photos and memories were deleted, would you still choose to go on that trip? Many people hesitate because they realize that much of the value of a trip lies in the ability to recount, share, and remember it, not just in enjoying it while it was happening. What I remember has a strange quality. It does not measure time honestly. A pleasant experience that lasts twice as long does not necessarily equate to twice as much happiness. Because what I remember only retains a few emotional milestones, especially the peak at the best or worst and the ending moment. This is the top rule. PCK Andrew Bottom. A great vacation that ends with a stormy day might be ranked lower than a just average trip that ends brilliantly. This applies even to unpleasant experiences. In one medical study, patients who underwent a painful procedure but ended with a few minutes of relief generally rated the experience as more pleasant than those who had a less total painful time but ended with a high pain level. My memory forgives the long run as long as the ending is better. This leads to a strange consequence. It is I who remembers that decides the future. When choosing a travel destination or career, we often rely on memories of previous experiences rather than on the actual quality of the moments lived. And because of distorted memories, our future choices are also misdirected. The difference between the two egos creates paradoxes that, if we don't pay attention, we will never notice. One of them is the happiness paradox. We often plan for the future based on the desires of our remembering ego, while the experiencing self is the one who actually lives in that future. Take a beach vacation for example. During the trip, you may have to endure many unpleasant moments, hot weather, long tiring car rides or unappetizing food. My experience would rate this as an okay or rather tiring vacation. But if a few brilliant moments come up, a beautiful sunset, a great night of partying and the trip ends on a good note, the me that remembers will retain the story of a great vacation. The same is true in reverse. A near-perfect experience that ends with a minor incident, lost wallet, argument or missed flight will be severely relegated to the memory. What I remember is not concerned with the whole, it is concerned with the climax and the ending. As a result, we make decisions based on a distorted version of real experience. When choosing my next vacation, I'm not asked if I'll enjoy every day of it, but if I'll tell this story again. What I remember is a skillful storyteller, but it is not honest with ourselves. Go deeper. I realize the duration and intensity of experiences do not add up in memory. An hour of listening to favorite music is not rated as twice as happy as half an hour. If the endings of both are the same, this is completely contrary to the logic of the experiencing ego. Capital adds up to every pleasant moment. This difference also affects medical decisions in many surgeries or treatments. Pain relief at the end of the procedure will make the patient remember the experience as more pleasant, even if the total amount of pain is not significantly reduced. Conversely, if a treatment session is shorter but ends with severe pain, the memory of it will be significantly worse. That's why, when creating a memorable experience, whether it's an event, a trip, or a media campaign, people often focus on creating a peak moment and a perfect ending. This is a strategy of talking directly to the ego in mind. The one who will keep the story and guide our actions later. As I understood the two selves, I began to realize a disturbing truth. The experiencing self can live a life full of pleasant moments. But what I remember is that life is boring, and that leads to decisions that change the whole direction. Imagine a stable job, comfortable environment, low pressure, every day goes smoothly. What I experience will be satisfying. It is lived in a long series of stress-free moments. But if that job doesn't create outstanding memories, doesn't have emotional peaks to keep, the me that remembers will gradually label this period of time as boring. And when faced with the choice between staying in that job or trying a new, challenging one, what I remember will motivate me to take risks, even though what I experience may be more miserable. This conflict explains why people sometimes choose arduous paths in exchange for a few moments of brilliance, or are willing to endure prolonged hardship in order to possess a story worth telling. A mountain climber conquers a peak in harsh weather conditions not because every moment is wonderful, but because the memory of victory will nourish the ego that remembers it for many years to come. I also realize that what I remember tends to measure happiness by stories, not by facts. If a life story sounds good and is full of milestones and exciting points, it will be considered worth living, regardless of the long periods of fatigue or pain the experiencing ego has endured. On the contrary, a life of little change, calm and steady. Although it brings a lot of happiness to the experiencing self, it can be considered meaningless in retrospect. What I remember needs material to build a compelling story. And this sometimes leads us to make decisions that are not optimal for true happiness on a daily basis. Another consequence is that we often misjudge the length of positive experiences. In memory, a 3-hour party is not necessarily 3 times as fun as a 1-hour party, if both end on a happy note. But a long party that ends blandly may be less appreciated than a short one that ends explosively. These things forced me to ask questions. When we say we want a happy life, whose happiness are we talking about? If the answer is that of the remembering self, we may be willing to sacrifice a lot of the actual happiness of the experiencing self. And sometimes it's more expensive than we think. Once I recognized the power of the ego, I began to see clearly how it not only shapes the story of the past, but also manipulates the way we plan for the future when deciding on a trip, a job, or a relationship. What I remember is not asking how my day will be, but asking, would this story be worth retelling? Because of this, many people choose experiences that the experiencing ego would consider difficult. Just because I remember, I believe it will be a precious memory. A student may choose to participate in a volunteer trip to a remote area, knowing that living conditions would be harsh, only to be able to recount it later as a memorable milestone. This phenomenon also occurs in the medical field when patients are asked what treatment they would like. Many people choose the more unpleasant but more dramatic method to recount instead of the gentler but equally effective method. This shows that sometimes the remembering self is willing to trade the actual comfort of the experiencing self in order to create a more powerful story. I call this the tyranny of memory. What I remember is that the biographer of my life always wants his story to be dramatic, with a climax and a memorable ending. But because of that, it can drag us into decisions that do not serve the ongoing well-being of the experiencing self. What's remarkable is that in many cases we don't even realize this conflict when we recall a wonderful vacation. We believe that every day of that vacation was enjoyable, even though reality can be tiring, boring, or frustrating at times. The story has been so carefully edited that we forget the less interesting parts. The tyranny of memory is further reinforced by society. We are encouraged to live so that we have something to tell. Accumulate memories as if memories were the only proof of life's worth. Social media makes this even stronger. The remembering self not only stores the story for itself but also projects it to the public, further blurring the line between living to experience and living to tell. This leads to a difficult question. If we want to maximize happiness, which self should we prioritize? If we prioritize the experiential self, we will choose a life that is comfortable, stable, with few climaxes but sustainable. If we prioritize what we remember, we will choose journeys that are full of ups and downs with emotional peaks. Despite having to accept many unpleasant moments along the way. If there is one greatest lesson to be learned from separating the two selves, it is that happiness is not a monolith. What I experience and what I remember have their own metrics, and they can lead us to completely different choices. The present-minded experiencing self measures happiness by the quantity and quality of pleasant moments. If one day I could live in peace, full of little things that make us smile, it will score very high. Regardless of whether there is any special event or not, it judges life like a long movie, in which every frame is important. What I remember is the opposite. It measures happiness by stories, by memorable highlights. It is willing to put up with hours, days, even months of discomfort if in return it means a glorious ending or an unforgettable climax. In its eyes, life is a novel and good novels need climaxes, even tragedies. This difference profoundly affects how we design our lives if we don't realize it. We can live in contradiction, planning according to the wishes of the remembering self, but being disappointed when the experiencing self is not happy. We can choose glamorous jobs, travel to faraway places, attend big events, only to realize that most of the time those choices are tiring, stressful and pressured. But it cannot be denied that the self that remembers gives us a sense of meaning if only optimized for the self that experiences it. Life may be smooth but it lacks stories that make us proud when we look back. Many people are willing to accept pain to remember. They are not looking for constant happiness but for a story worth telling. The difficult question is how to balance the two egos. The answer probably lies in being aware of their existence and knowing which ones you prioritize in every decision. If a choice results in few pleasant moments but creates a vivid memory, accept that proactively rather than letting the memory manipulate you. Conversely, if you want a peaceful life, protect your experiential self. Even if the story seems bland from the outside. Because in the end, we are both the main character of the movie being shown and the audience watching it again, and it would be a mistake to let one of those two roles completely overshadow the other. A complete life is perhaps one in which we feel warmth in every moment and when we look back we find the story worth telling again. Thank you for taking the time to read this book to the very last page. I know not everyone has the patience to choose a journey filled with concepts, experiments and psychological layers that sometimes make us stop and wonder how many times we have been wrong about ourselves. Reading a book like this is not just about receiving information, but also about looking into the mirror of your own thinking. With all the cracks, the membranes and the illusions. If what you just heard makes you pause, question an old belief, or quietly adjust a decision, then this book has served its purpose. I hope you will leave a review or comment. Not to measure the book's quality by conventional yardsticks, but to record with me a part of your own thinking experience. What has changed, what remains strong, and what makes you want to dig deeper? And if you have a book that you'd love to hear, to dissect, to reflect on together, please suggest it to me. Because the journey of discovery of knowledge is never a solitary path. It is an endless dialogue between curious people, willing to question both the world and themselves.